Hello, welcome to English American Literature 2, Unit 6, and Inspector Calls 2. In this unit, you have studied the acts of the play. And now, in this video, we are going to first summarize the acts briefly and analyze them briefly again. Let's start with the summary of the first act. The play opens in the dining room of the Burlings' home. Sheila and Gerald Croft got engaged and they are celebrating their engagement. Arthur Burling is very proud to have her daughter marry the son of a respectable family and sees their marriage as a kind of profit and contribution to his own business. However, the Croft family is not in the family dinner. Arthur Burling gives a long speech about his views about technology, state of the world, industrial relations, politics, the Titanic, future and family relations, and responsibilities. As he is making his grand speech, the doorbell rings and the inspector comes. The inspector is Inspector Gooley. Mr. Burling doesn't recognize him, but Gooley says that he's just new in the city and came to investigate about the suicide of a young woman. She is called Eva Smith, and the reason why the inspector comes to their home is that he says their names are on the diary that is found in the room of Eva Smith. Gooley first investigates Mr. Burling. We learn that Mr. Burling fired Eva 18 months ago because she was one of the ringleaders in a strike for better payment. However, Burling does not accept any responsibility for the suicide of Eva Smith. Sheila enters the room and is questioned by Gooley. We are informed that after being fired by Mr. Burling, Eva changed her name and started working in a shop where Sheila visited very frequently. We also learned that Sheila asked the manager to fire the girl, and after hearing the suicide, Sheila really feels sorry and somehow responsible for the suicide of the girl. Gooley says Eva changed her name once more after this event, and this time we learned that Gerald had an affair with Eva a year ago, which explains his long absence. And the act ends thus. Now let's have a look at the analysis of the play. When we analyze the first act by looking at the setting and the conversations, we can understand that the Burlings are a rich family. We also learn about the significance of the class distinctions in the first act. Mr. Burling is a capitalist who thinks he has the right to do anything he wants. The absence of the Croft family also indicates that they do not approve of the marriage because they are from the upper class and they are about the Burlings. Another detail that contributes to the class distinction is the silent presence of the maid Edna, who is just ignored by the other characters. The first act is ironic because it's an ironic summary of the first half of the 20th century with Burling's inappropriate predictions about the sinking of the Titanic and the beginning of the Second World War. When we come to the second act begins with Sheila's insistence to stay in the room during the investigation. She tries to anticipate her role in the suicide of Eva, and as she is speculating about her own responsibility, Mrs. Burling enters and tries to control the situation. Inspector Gooley then begins questioning Gerald. Gerald talks about how he met Eva in a music hall and how they started and ended their relationship. Sheila breaks the engagement upon hearing this. Gooley suspects that Mrs. Burling also knew Eva, although she denies it, and begins questioning her. Soon we learn that 2 weeks ago, Eva visited the charity organization that Mrs. Burling worked, and Mrs. Burling convinced the charity members to refuse to help Eva because she was pregnant. Mrs. Burling doesn't assume any responsibility for the suicide and wants Gooley to find the father of the baby, but Sheila just figures out that the father of the baby is Eric, who has drinking problems. When we analyze the second act, we can understand that Sheila has the leading role with her efforts to sympathize and change in her mood. The girl, who starts the play very cheerfully, begins to transform into a more thoughtful character who tries to weigh her responsibility in the suicide of Eva Smith. Sheila's efforts to understand is juxtaposed with Mrs. Burling's insistence, and this can be interpreted as the ability of the younger generation to change, whereas the older generation seems to be fixed in their thoughts. The scene also develops Gully as a character. He is presented as a mysterious character who controls the events. He has specific tactics to make the characters confess about their actions. When we come to the last act of the play begins with Eric's investigation. We learn that Eric met Eva in a bar, and he was the father of the baby that Eva was pregnant to, and he also stole some money from his father. When the investigation is over, Gully leaves after giving a moral lesson that we are all responsible for each other. When Gully leaves, the characters begin to discuss whether Gully was really an inspector or not, and whether the suicide really happened or not. Gerald and Mr. Burling confirmed that no one knew about an inspector called Gully, but Eric and Sheila declared that they are not real, that there is no suicide, would not change anything. They still feel responsible. After Mr. Burling confirms that there is no suicide in the town by calling the hospital, they receive a phone call from the police station in which they are informed that there is a police on the way their home because a girl just suicided, just as Eva did, and there's an inspection for the suicide of the girl. When we analyze the last act of the play ensures that all of the characters have somehow a relationship with Eva, and every one of them have a responsibility in her suicide. This act demonstrates how the younger generation is able to change, whereas the older are resistant to change and are selfish. We can understand this from Sheila and Eric, who try to understand their role in the suicide of Eva, whereas Mr. and Mrs. Burling just deny their responsibilities. This can also be exemplified by Mr. Burling's concerning only with his public fame and position.